In 1815, Nathan Rothschild made £40 million in a single day. That's $4 billion in today's money. The largest one-day profit in financial history. How? He knew Napoleon lost at Waterloo before the British government did, and he bet everything on it. In 1914, the Rothschild family financed Britain, France, and Russia in World War I billions in loans. In 1939, they financed multiple sides again in World War II through complex banking networks. 4 major wars. 4 massive fortunes. Same family. And here's what they don't teach you in history class. The Rothschilds didn't just profit from wars, they financed both sides every time. When nations fought, they borrowed. When they borrowed, the Rothschilds profited. Win or lose. This isn't conspiracy. This is documented banking history. And once you see how it worked, you'll understand why one family accumulated more wealth than most nations, and why they still control a significant portion of global finance today. Let me show you the 4 wars, the 4 fortunes, and the system they built that still operates. Before we go through the wars, you need to understand what the Rothschild family actually created. Not just a bank, a network. In 1760, Mayer Amschel Rothschild started as a small moneylender in Frankfurt, Germany. He had 5 sons, and he did something unprecedented. He sent each son to a different financial capital in Europe. 1 to Frankfurt, 1 to Vienna, 1 to London, 1 to Paris, 1 to Naples. 5 banks, 5 cities, 1 family. This created something that had never existed before. A banking network that could move money across borders faster than governments. They could communicate through private couriers while nations relied on slow mail. They had agents in every capital who knew what governments were planning before official announcements. This information advantage was more valuable than gold, and they used it to become the most powerful financial dynasty in history. Let me show you how the first fortune was built on the Napoleonic Wars from 1803 to 1815. This is where the Rothschild fortune truly began. Europe was at war, Napoleon's France versus Britain, Austria, Russia, Prussia. Armies need supplies. Governments need gold. And moving gold across war zones was nearly impossible unless you had a network like the Rothschilds. The British government needed to pay their armies fighting in Europe, but they couldn't transport gold across French-controlled territory. Nathan Rothschild, based in London, solved this problem. He bought gold in London, smuggled it through France using his family's network, and delivered it to British troops in Spain and Portugal. The British paid him a premium, a large premium. He wasn't just moving gold. He was the only one who could move it safely during wartime. This made him indispensable to the British government. But here's what's darker. The Rothschilds were also financing the other side. Through their Frankfurt and Vienna branches, they provided loans to Austrian and Prussian governments fighting Napoleon. They didn't care who won. They profited from the financing itself. Interest on war loans doesn't depend on victory. It depends on governments needing money. And during war, governments always need money. The Waterloo moment in 1815 is legendary. On June 18th, 1815, Napoleon fought the Duke of Wellington at Waterloo in Belgium. The outcome would determine Europe's future. Nathan Rothschild had agents at the battlefield. When Napoleon was defeated, Rothschild's courier raced to London. He arrived a full day before the official British messenger. Nathan knew Britain had won before the government or the markets did. And here's what he did. He went to the London Stock Exchange and started selling British government bonds. Aggressively. Other traders saw this and panicked. If Rothschild is selling, Britain must have lost. The market crashed. Bond prices collapsed, and when they hit bottom, Nathan bought massive quantities at pennies on the pound. Then, the official news arrived. Britain won. Bond prices exploded. Nathan Rothschild made an estimated £40 million in one day. That's over $4 billion today. The single largest speculative profit in financial history up to that point. This established the Rothschild fortune and their reputation. They had information faster than governments. They had capital to deploy globally, and they had no loyalty to nations, only to profit. This model would repeat for the next 200 years. The second fortune came from financing European governments in the 1800s. After the Napoleonic Wars, Europe was rebuilding. Governments needed money, infrastructure, railroads, industrial development, and the Rothschilds became the primary lenders to European monarchies. They financed the British government repeatedly throughout the 1800s. They financed Austria, Prussia, Russia, France, not one nation, all of them. When France needed money, they borrowed from the Paris Rothschild Bank. When Austria needed money, Vienna Rothschild. When Britain needed money, London Rothschild. But it was all the same family, the same capital pool. They were lending to nations that were rivals, sometimes enemies. And they structured the loans brilliantly. Government bonds backed by tax revenue. If the government defaulted, the Rothschilds had first claim on the nation's tax income. This gave them leverage over government's kings, and ministers came to the Rothschilds asking for permission to borrow, not the other way around. By the mid-1800s, the Rothschild family controlled an estimated 50% of the world's wealth. Not exaggeration. Historians estimate their fortune in the 1850s was larger than the combined wealth of the next richest families in Europe. They weren't just rich, they were richer than nations. And they used this wealth to gain political influence. Rothschild banks advised governments on monetary policy. They influenced central bank decisions. They had access to state secrets because governments needed their money. This is when the family transitioned from bankers to power brokers. The third fortune was World War I from 1914 to 1918. This was the Rothschild model at industrial scale. Europe went to war. Britain, France, and Russia on one side, Germany, and Austria on the other. The cost was catastrophic. $200 billion in total war expenditures. And much of it was financed through loans. The Rothschilds, particularly the British and French branches, financed the Allied powers. Britain borrowed billions to pay for the war. France borrowed billions, Russia borrowed billions. The loans were structured as war bonds sold to the public and to institutional investors, many controlled or influenced by Rothschild banks. The interest on these loans was paid by taxpayers after the war, but here's the complexity. The Rothschild network was fractured by World War I. The German and Austrian branches were technically on the other side. Publicly, the family claimed neutrality and separation, but financial historians have documented that the network continued operating. Money moved through neutral countries, Switzerland, the Netherlands. The family maintained communication even while their host nations were at war. Whether they directly financed Germany is debated, but what's clear is they profited from both sides indirectly through bond markets, commodities, and currency speculation. By the end of World War I, European governments were drowning in debt. Much of it owed to Rothschild-controlled or influenced institutions. Britain's national debt increased by 1,000% during the war. France's debt exploded. Germany was bankrupted by reparations. And the Rothschilds, along with other banking families, held the notes. The interest payments funded the family for decades. War debts from World War I were still being paid into the 1980s by some nations. The fourth fortune, or rather the shift, was World War II and the creation of modern central banking. By the 1930s, the Rothschild fortune was still enormous. But the political landscape was changing. Nationalism was rising. Nazi Germany explicitly targeted Jewish families, including the Rothschilds. The Vienna branch was seized by the Nazis in 1938. Family members fled or were killed. The war devastated the European branches. But here's what happened after the Rothschilds pivoted. Instead of directly financing governments, they embedded themselves in the central banking system. The Bank of England, which the Rothschilds had close ties to for over a century, became the model for modern central banks globally. The Federal Reserve in the U.S., established in 1913, followed similar structures, and Rothschild-affiliated banks and individuals were involved in advising the creation of these institutions. Post-World War II, the Rothschild network shifted from being direct lenders to governments to being advisors, board members, and stakeholders. In central banks and multinational financial institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Bank for International Settlements. These institutions, which effectively govern global finance, have had Rothschild-connected individuals in key positions throughout their history. Today, the Rothschild family doesn't operate the same way they did in 1815. The fortune is dispersed among hundreds of descendants. The banks are no longer the world's largest. They're boutique investment banks. Rothschild & Co. is still a major player in mergers, acquisitions, and sovereign advising, but they're not the monopoly they once were. Estimates of current family wealth range from $400 billion to over $1 trillion when you include all branches and descendants. It's impossible to know exactly because the wealth is hidden in trusts, foundations, and private holdings across dozens of countries. But the model they created, financing governments, profiting from war, influencing central banks, that model still exists. It's just been adopted by other institutions. Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, BlackRock, Vanguard. These entities do what the Rothschilds did. They finance governments. They profit from conflict. They influence monetary policy. The Rothschilds pioneered it. The system scaled. So what do we take from this? 4 wars: Napoleonic Wars, European Reconstruction, World War I, World War II. 4 fortunes built or sustained by financing conflict. The Rothschild family proved that war is profitable if you finance both sides, that governments are willing to borrow at any cost during crisis, and that financial networks with information advantages can extract wealth from nations over centuries. This isn't about hating one family. It's about understanding how the system works. Wars are expensive. Governments borrow. Banks profit. The people pay through taxes and inflation. This pattern predates the Rothschilds and will continue after them. But they perfected it. They made it generational. And they built a fortune larger than most nations by being the middlemen of conflict. 4 wars. 4 fortunes, 1 family. The Rothschilds financed every side and profited regardless of outcome. That's not conspiracy. That's documented banking history. If this changed how you see war, finance, and who profits from conflict, subscribe. Because the system they built is still operating today under different names. The pattern is clear, the history is documented, and the answers aren't hidden. They're in the archives, the banking records, and the family trees of those who financed empires.